So today's guest is Pauline Vicard, who's the co-founder and executive director of ARENI Global, which is the international think tank dedicated to the future of fine wine. So ARENI's most recent report, The New Fine Wine Consumer, studied buyers under 40 across 6 cities worldwide, and they found out that much of what we believe about what the next generation of wine lovers think, it's simply wrong. She is based in London. Well, welcome, Pauline. This is kind of the cheat episode. But before we get into the cheat part, which is you've done all the research, could you talk a little bit about your background? And I'm asking that mostly because it's super interesting where you ended up as a researcher. So if we could kind of back up in time and know you a little bit, then I think the rest will be a little easier to digest.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, John, for having me on your podcast. I'm very excited to be here. So my background is I come from a family of winemaker in Burgundy. So I grew up in the estate and I've worked in the vineyard for the first 2 decades of my life. And when you are the kid of a farmer, it's literally the first 2 decades. You start really early. I've spent a lot of time walking, and of course, you don't really help when you're 10 years old, but you find your way, you find a way to do something as useful as possible. So I grew up in the estate working, we don't have school on Wednesday in France. So all my Wednesdays I was working in the vineyard, and on the weekend I was helping on the, labeling, putting the bottle in boxes, going to fairs with my parents. So really doing the groundwork. And again, as you know, in Burgundy, estates tend to be very small, and they tend to be, if you're the owner, you're also the viticulturist and the winemaker and the commercial person. So my parents' estates were really much like this. It was a family estate where my mom and my brother and I were working as much as we could. But it was, and it's important to note this for a podcast of wine trade and wine lovers. I'm not part of the shiny part of Burgundy, so I'm not part of the Côte de Nuit or Côte de Beaune of the royalty of Burgundy. I was more in the Hautes-Côtes de Beaune, in Saône-et-Loire, and that means my parents had a very traditional business model. So they were selling 80% to the négoce and 20% with their own bottle.
Yeah, and so fast forwarding, you end up in London in what I consider a little bit more of a traditional wine career. And this move toward becoming kind of the researcher for the wine industry takes place. Tell me about that. Like, what happened to you that sparked that
So I arrived in London a bit more than 10 years ago. And before I arrived in London, I've almost, apart from 2 years that were a bit of a bracket, I've always worked in the wine industry. So I've worked in market research for the Burgundy Wine Office or other, general body in the wine trade. I worked for the French embassy abroad, helping wine producer to export to those markets. I had a shop. I had a restaurant selling wine. I've done a lot of events. I've done a lot of teaching and training. And I wanted to, the move to go for the UK is I wanted to learn other wines than just French wine. And it's quite difficult to find other wines in France. And I wanted to learn and expand my knowledge of wine. And London seemed to be the perfect place to do that because you find every single wine on the planet in London. Events that I was running, I met Nicole Rollet, who's the co-founder of ARENI Global. She's a winemaker in the south of France, but she's got nothing typical of a French winemaker. She's half American, half Italian. She worked in finance all her life, and her husband, who was at the time the head of the London Stock Exchange, actually fall in love with that amazing 12th century property in the Ventoux region, in the north of Provence, and decided to invest a lot. And long story short, after 10 years, she wanted to think about the future of fine wine and actually to think about and reflect on all those changes that were happening in terms of geopolitics, environment, societal change. And she couldn't find a space like she had in finance where you could do that, those type of, think tank where you could gather a bunch of experts on different things, throw them questions and see what comes into, if we want to imagine what fine wine will be in 50 years. So she had that idea, and I was coming from the point of view that we needed to help the industry understanding the change. So we came with the same conclusion, coming from totally different background. And I guess it started really quickly like this, with her network as well of people that were not in the wine, because one of the issues we wanted to address is often the wine industry is very insular in its thinking for many different reasons. And so we also wanted to bring expertise from geopolitics, from tech, from science, from gastronomy, from luxury. Because if you want to understand the world we are living in and how it impacts us, you need to have all those experts bringing in that expertise. And she had the network for that, and I had a very granular understanding of how the wine world was working and the question that the wine world was asking itself. And so we came up with that idea of that first think tank that a couple of years later led to the creation of ARENI Global that I'm not now running.
So, you know, the thesis of this podcast is, of course, the exploration of what is happening with young people
Yeah.
and how to expand the market. Obviously, you've identified that we live in a very insular industry that probably relies a little bit on an echo chamber of wine people talking to wine people, which is probably the worst possible way to figure out the future. And so you spent some time researching it. So let's kind of break that out a little bit. Talk to me a little bit about some of the hypotheses, like where you started from in your research, and what kind of held up and what didn't, and why.
So the question that we heard, that we were hearing all the time, is it, we hear everywhere that young people are not drinking wine anymore, but we also hear that young people are drinking less but better. And because we specialize in that segment that we call fine wine, but it's a bit by default because fine wine means different things to different people, to different culture. But I'm going to say the top of the pyramid, whatever you define that in your own country and your own market, and wine that thrives to be excellent, to be the greatest version of what they can be. And if for that particular segment of the wine world, the question we were asked was like, well, maybe that means that people are drinking more fine wine then, because if people are drinking less but better, is there a way that can benefit us? And we chose not to take that question up front because it's a question that's very hard to answer, because again, we don't have one definition for fine wine, and finding the data to answer that lives in different silos. But also, even if we had been able to do it, then you have the only answer, which is yes and no. And there's not a lot of activation that you can say, yes, people are drinking less fine wine than before, or yes, people are drinking more fine wine than before. What we really wanted to understand is, amongst the young people that are currently buying and drinking fine wine, that we had to define with a price point, because we did quantitative research, and when you have to do quantitative, you have to put a price on. The people that are currently buying and drinking those more expensive wine, how come their interest started? Like, where and when did they become interested in that product? And from the moment they were interested in that, can we identify levers that would have, led them to become regular buyers of that? So that's really what we wanted to understand. And we did it in 6 different markets. So Paris, London, New York, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Shanghai. We wanted to have markets that were considered with different maturity when it came to fine wine culture and fine wine drinking. We wanted to have different culture represented in the study, and etc. And yes, you're right. We had 6 hypotheses at the very beginning, and only one came really like as true. All the other ones ended up either being refuted or being nuanced a lot. So even us as researcher, we were very surprised by the results, if that makes sense.
Sure.
We couldn't expect those results to be um, and the first thing that we couldn't expect is how similar the patterns will be between different markets. We One of the hypotheses would be there will be patterns for the West and pattern for the East, and there will be patterns for countries that have a deeply ingrained wine culture, like France, and have had generations before the young consumers before them drinking wine. And there will be difference with market like Shanghai, which is still very new to fine wine culture, you know, relatively new compared to the big scheme of things. And actually, there wasn't that many difference between markets. The biggest difference that we found in terms of consumer behavior, journey, and expectation were between male and female. So it was more a difference in gender than a difference of geographic origin, and we didn't really see that coming. We had the hypothesis that collectors and buyers would be different, and that's the one that actually been um, confirmed by the research, and we can explain why collectors and drinkers, what people that buy and drink, are different. We thought that young people would mostly be exposed to fine wine through family, and then we had student association, restaurants, and travel as other places where they could have been exposed to fine wine. And it turned out family doesn't play that much of a big role. That was one of the biggest surprise. Um,
I assume, by the way, that that
yeah,
also knocks out this idea that the geographical differences would become small. In other words, the hypothesis is you have generations of people drinking in France. You really don't drink fine wine or see your parents drinking fine wine, maybe in Shanghai, but ultimately those two things are kind of correlated. That turns out that it's not hereditary, maybe in a way that we
yeah, and
instinctually think.
it's partly because there's an international element to culture now. When it comes to food and gastronomy, there are elements that you can find everywhere around the world. So it doesn't really matter if you live in Paris, Shanghai, London, or New York. In those big megalopolis, there's a lot of common points when it comes to food, for example. So it's not you can find top food of all those cultures in all of those cities. And I guess wine follows a slightly different trajectory, but that can be one of the elements. And also because, the first thing that we've learned, the biggest surprise is that it's not family, it's friends. So the fact that you have that the generation before you was drinking wine is not as important because actually fine wine drinking is something which is a very personal, self-centered thing that you do for yourself. For example, we asked people what they were drinking fine wine, and as a French, I was expecting, and that's French, that's me, that's not the rest of the research team, but I thought we would have a lot of people saying that they were buying fine wine to give to the next generation, because that's something which is quite important for French people. At least it was, to build a cellar that you can pass on to your children. But apparently, fine wine drinking and buying something which is very self-centered, you do that for yourself. So what it means when you do that for yourself is that when you're 20, 25, or from legal age drinking, you're not really listening to your parents. You don't really look at your parents to define who you are or who you could be. You look at a lot to your friends and to your peers in terms of age group. So whether or not your parents were drinking wine or fine wine doesn't matter so much as the fact that your friends do actually impact that. And people came to fine wine through haha moments. So either they tasted a wine that was so much better than everything they've ever tasted, and they're like, oh, I need to understand why that wine is so much better. Like, I never really considered that wine could taste like this. Funnily enough, when you interview ultra high net worth individuals, they tell you the other story. So that the ha moment came when they entered university and tasted something else than Romanée Conti and Petrus. And suddenly they realized that not all the wines were tasting like Romanée Conti and Petrus. That can be the reverse. But those bottles were bought by friends and people that look like them in terms of age group. Um, and then it can also be they traveled with friends and they saw um, a label with a price and a price tag and couldn't understand why that wine was so expensive. So they wanted to investigate. Actually, what happens is that through friends, curiosity emerge. And so curiosity emerged, they understand that there's something that they don't understand about wine. And because their friends also are interested in finding out, then it means that it's socially licensed for them to pursue that interest. And if you had parents that were interested in wine themselves before, then you go back to them. And then it's quite helpful to have your parents that were already in fine wine. But I guess as long as you don't have someone of your age group that validates your curiosity, it's just something that your parents do, but it's not for you. You haven't integrated the fact that it can be for you.
Yeah, one of the things that you noted, and we kind of skipped over to the friends, which I do want to get back to, is the gender differences. So, what
Yeah.
did you see with gender that made a difference? And does that have anything to do with a propensity for males to collect things a little bit more? Um,
So,
or what is
well,
it?
there's a lot of different things in what you're asking me is that um so the first thing that we found out between male and female that wasn't a surprise was the ratio of respondent of the two genders, because that's something that's quite well known in the wine industry. When you look at your consumer base, whether you're a merchant or an auction house, you're going to see that in Europe and in the US, you usually have a proportion which is around 75 to 80% of men consumers and 20% of female consumers. If you are based in London or New York and you have more than 20% of your consumer base that are female, you're doing really good in gender diversity. In Asia, it's much different, and usually the ratio is a bit more balanced, with 35 to 40% of a wine merchant consumer base that, or an auction house, that would be women. And there's difference in this that are historical, because in Europe, wine is associated with men. It's part of their status, their journey, and everything, and it's something that's considered a man thing. Whether in Asia, it's something that's considered a an elite thing somehow, like something that you do as a status thing, but it's more because it's Western, it's considered a status thing for everyone who's achieved their career. And it came in Asia at a time where gender balance was already better in terms of finance and revenue, that when it started in Europe, where women didn't have the right to vote or to have a bank account and everything. So what we first found is that through the questionnaire we had the same ratio, and we had that confirmed this. What we were surprised on was when we worked with um, the younger the age group, the bigger proportion of women there was. And we started with the under 25, and then 20, and then we had age group by 5 years, so 25 to 31, and etc. And we also did some extra work with some student association of the university that have tasting groups. So, with the London School of Economics, they have the backers group, and every week they meet and they do wine tasting and everything. Those groups usually have a very good gender ratio balance. So they usually have like 40% women, 60% men. And so within the student environment, the gender balance, even in London, was quite balanced. But the minute people enter working life and go out of that student life, the number of women drop in a very important manner. And every age group sees women dropping, like a bigger proportion of men and a smaller proportion of female. It is important to note that the study that we've done, we haven't done it through time. So it can just be that the higher proportion of female that are under 25 now will continue to eh, to be, represent a higher proportion of consumers when they move age group. We don't know if it's a pattern, and by the time you're 25 you're dropping. I can't say that. What I can say is, through the interview, what we've seen as well is that everything that is required to be a today considered a serious wine drinker, wine buyer, collector, whatever, requires a lot of things that maybe brings more obstacles for women. For example, the defining decade for a wine drinker slash collector is between 26 and 35. That's usually how you define yourself. And that decade, which is really key in building your identity, your taste, your palate, how you buy, if you collect, what's a collection for you, how you want to organize it, like to find your purpose. That's the decade which obviously between 26 and 35, every woman that wants to have a family will take a step back from the world and from the world of alcohol. So that adds something. There's also the fact that when we've asked people, that's a joke. It's not something that we've put on a study, but that's how I personally interpret it, is people between 26 and 35 told us that they normally spend between 12 and 15 hours a week to between developing their knowledge, knowing the people that they need to know, knowing the price of the bottle that they're buying, maintaining their cellar. And in my head I was thinking, what type of women between 26 and 35 that do want to have a career and or a family has 15 hours of free time in their hand? So that, it wasn't expressed like this, but that was my first reaction as a woman with two kids and a career. So I wouldn't have been able to be a collector just because I wouldn't have had the time to actually learn about collecting. And then you said, is it about the proportion of male collecting more than female? This one I will actually challenge a bit, because so far what I understand of the collecting world is not a function of gender, but it's a function of money and revenue. And the fact that there's more men collecting is not because they're men, but because they've had access to financial independence for longer. And actually, that's what interesting to see in Asia, is that as a whole population, that equally access to money, both men and female, you see a lot of female choosing the collecting route. So that's something that I'm hoping, as financial conditions for women improve, we're going to see more collectors being female, and hopefully some of them in the wine segment.
So on kind of the myth busting, or at least what you would classically think of. One of those is this idea that younger people are just drinking less, that it's health, et cetera, et cetera. And you address that too. So let's talk about that. Is it true that younger people are just drinking less?
So there's all the data that we have and the understanding that we have is confirms a change in drinking pattern, and a change that goes towards less in terms of global volume. Now, is what's interesting is there's not a single reason that can explain this. It's a mix of factors that led us to be in that situation. And some of those factors, we can't really do anything about it when you talk about global data. And so one of the things, for example, if you look at the global alcohol segment and why there is less alcohol consumed, one of the interesting answer to that, it's also because there are less young people globally in mature markets. Because if you look at what you need to have a growth in alcohol consumption, the majority of what you are going to drink in terms of alcohol is going to be condensed into from legal age drinking to 40, and then you have a first drop of volume, and then you have a second drop at 60 and another drop at 70. And for women the drop can be a bit before 40. So if statistically speaking, when you look at what do we need in order to increase the sale of alcohol, you need an increase in young people. And this is not, demographics do not play in our favor here, because Europe has a drastic drop into young people. I think Germany is like 11%, minus 11% of that, 25 to 30 cohort of people. China is losing a lot of young people as well. And then the second thing for us, when we operate in the most expensive, in a more expensive segment, you also need young people, but you also need young people with money. So it means you need mature economy to have that. And if you cross mature economy and growing population, The US is one of the only country that do has that. But for example, in the US, there's also a growth in population, or in Europe, growth of population that are linked to population that don't traditionally drink alcohol as well. Um, because there's loads of countries where you have a growing young people like India, Nigeria, all those countries, Brazil, that do represent an interest. But for the wine world, they're still like, we don't have the logistics. The tax system is difficult. It's not overnight that you can go and you can sell a lot of wine to those countries. So that's one of the reasons. Then you have reasons about generational change, and you never use the same. You try to challenge. You try to challenge what your parents are doing. So if your parents were drinking a lot of wine, you're going to change that. So that's one. There's also that, in the Gen Z that we're talking about so often, the Gen Z that is now, entering the marketplace and the workspace and normally should start drinking, are the people that were in lockdown between the age of 16 to 20. So all their socialization year that normally in most Western culture include alcohol at some point, they did that at home with their parents. So they had a very, very different way of socializing than any other generation. I'm not sure that the Gen Z generation that will come into the workplace in 4 or 5 years won't be different, because they will have access to the same socialization years. Then you have economics reason, and those are really, really important one. I mean, there's less money everywhere, or at least people feel like they have less money, whether one or the other. And when you have less money, you cut things, and inflation in big cities haven't helped. I mean, the price of a glass of wine in New York or in London is absolutely crazy today. When you're asking £18 for a glass of wine in a restaurant, you really cutting your consumer base. You're reducing your consumer base de facto.
Um,
And
I,
the
I don't
the
mean to
la-
interrupt
yeah,
on that, but go ahead, and then I have a follow up to your $18 problem.
and then the last one is a societal change, so the place of alcohol in society. And that is also changing, because until now we didn't really question the place of alcohol in society. We had a role for alcohol, like we knew there was risk, but we knew there was also some benefit of that wine drinking culture. And that's something that is changing, just like meat. The position in meat in society is changing as well. So some of those food associated products that we thought were going to be here forever are actually being challenged. And again, socialization is changing, and because of digital and because of COVID, young people socialize differently. And the last point about society and where society is at the moment, when everything is chaotic around you, the only thing that you can control is your body. So it's also a reclaim of I can control my body. And it's what we call the gym culture, is how the gym replaced the pub in the UK as a place of socialization for young people, how the vocabulary of tech enter food. So food is no longer a fuel nor a pleasure. It's a way to maximize the performance of your body. And if you're eating to maximize the performance of your body or the longevity of your body, the places of wine in this is yet to be found, because you're going to eat protein powder more than you're going to go for alcohol related products. So that it's all of this, and it's hard to know. I mean, if economics were to turn around overnight and tomorrow we are in economies that are booming and people that trust in economy, I'm sure we will gain back some of that consumption. But there are still some very deep structural change. And the longer it takes for the economy to come back, the more structural the change will be, because people will have developed different habits. I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
Hopefully now this works.
Yeah.
So part of the thing that you brought up was the $18 glass of wine problem. Um, and I just want to kind of feel this out. It's this tension between accessibility, right, and then promoting luxury. So how did you find that tension, and where do you land on recommendations for the wine industry of how to approach this?
I mean, your point is like, what price should we sell wine? Like, I'm trying to reformulate your
I
question.
guess I think my question really is that obviously we need to have ways for people to get interested in wine, right? And we have a relatively high price point. At the same time, we have the tension, which is that part of the appeal of wine is luxury and elegance. And so what
Yeah.
are those on ramps that we can use?
So I'll just specify on that 18-pound glass of wine. The problem is not it's the full problem is not the 18 pounds, is that you are selling for 18 pounds a wine that is worth 12. It's the value for money thing on top of everything. Because I mean, selling an 18 price is expensive for people, cheap for others. Like, what's expensive is actually relative. But what has happened in the last 2 years is, with restaurants changing totally the way they operate in terms of margins, you end up having very average wine at a very high price, or what was considered before a high price, where you had very good wine at that price. Now you have an average one. And that's also, consumers are not stupid. When they're paying 18 pounds for a Pinot Grigio that they could have buy for £5 at Sainsbury's, it's a supermarket in the UK, they actually can taste that. So they will not, they won't order a second one because they can taste that it's average. But if they pay 18 pounds for something that provokes emotions to them and is memorable, they might have a second one. So it's that relative price for value that is not really good at the moment. The question about, I don't really know how to address your question directly, but I will address this with one of the key learnings that we also had in the exploration, is that the equation of dreams that has been theorized by a economist, which is called Jean-Noël Capferrer, who's a French expert on business model luxury, on yeah, luxury business models. Sorry, I got that in the wrong order. Um, so he's theorized what you actually need to sell expensive product that are considered expensive by an important part of the population. And for him, it's visibility, desirability, purchase. So, in order to be bought by a few, what you need is to be visible by a lot of people, so you can be desired by most of those people and bought by a few, because only a few will have the money to buy yourself. So, regardless of how expensive you are and how expensive you are in terms of benchmark and other people and what the market is ready to pay, you will have to work on that equation of dream. You will have to work on being visible by more people that can actually buy you. And one of the things that has happened at the highest level of fine wine, so the smaller niche that you can imagine, and some of those labels that are known all around the world and recognized all around the world, is most of them have disappeared from the public eye. Like, they're not on the shelf anymore. They are only doing some very specific event with very specific ultra high net worth, which is logical. Those consumers have the money to buy their wines, but they haven't. The wine world, collectively and individually, hasn't really worked on that notion of visibility. And so that has some impact on the brand level, but that also some impact on the collective level. If you want wine culture to survive, wine drinking has to be visible. You have to be able to see people drinking wine in order for you to consider that as a potential um, choice for yourself. And so, if less people are drinking wine in restaurants because the value for money is no good, then you're kind of impacting the long-term survival of the industry. Not blaming any specific restaurants, but that has some responsibility in the global scheme of things, because every time we lose some visibility of people drinking wine in cultural representation, that has some impact on future sales, because the less we see people drinking wine, the less we want to drink wine, the less it becomes aspirational to do so. And you ask me about, that's an interesting point about aspiration. That wasn't part of the study. It's another structure that did that study, and that was a French one. But that was a very interesting one about asking people what a wine drinker looks like. And one of those personas was what they called the CEO. So, the typical fine wine drinker, I would say, like 45-year-old man, very well dressed. You've achieved your career, you've climbed all the ladders. Now you're wearing a nice suit and you're eating and drinking the best. That figure used to be very aspirational. And what we are actually seeing is that for the younger part of the population, this is less and less aspirational. Because if you look, I don't know if it's directly linked, that's my explanation of it. It's part of my explanation, is that popular culture and Netflix in particular, and Netflix since COVID has been depicting wine drinkers as despicable people. So if you think of Succession, if you think at The White Lotus, if you think at Game of Thrones, who drinks wine? The despicable, uber rich people that are questionable, ethically. You don't want to be them. You don't want to be any of the royal children if you're a Succession. You don't want to be a Lannister. You don't want them to be them. They're mean, and they're the only one drinking wine. So it's working on, collectively. There's a huge part of the collective imagery about who drinks wine is turning to be quite negative as well, and we all have a responsibility towards that.
So I think that's actually super interesting observations. And as an industry, there are probably a lot of things I took as an action item out of that. For example, that it would benefit us greatly if instead of pricing wine at the same price point as cocktails, where even wine drinkers in restaurants tend to drift toward cocktails to bring that price of wine down to a more
Yeah.
reasonable level to promote it. And
Yeah.
I agree, and I think that's great. So on a more kind of day to day level,
Yeah, an actionable thing. Yeah.
yeah. Why
Uh,
don't you give me like a few things? Because I'm opening a wine bar, right?
one
So
and
what are free consultings for how we can make this better?
All right,
Yeah,
free consulting for you
yeah.
and for your wine bar. That's really actionable. On one of the key findings for me is we thought the general thinking is young people will trade up in price as they go along in their career. So as your career progress and your spending power progress, you almost automatically spend more in wine because you have more to spend. Actually, this is only partially true. You only spend more on wine if you have people to drink the bottle with. If your community of friends does not trade up with you, or if you don't find a new community of friends that would be at the same price point and the same interest level than you, then you stop progressing. And what it means is that community is central for developing wine sales and wine drinkers and wine collectors. And what it means for people that do events like wine bars, like wineries, is that they have to curate the room really well. Something that we can learn from the top hospitality people is how to curate a room. And usually today, wine events or wine tickets or everything which is a ticketed wine tasting is just sold to anyone who wants to buy the ticket. Or if you're in a bit more exclusive environment, it would be your private advisor that will just decide on who they will sell the ticket to. If we change the gear a bit, and if we change that and remember why, that's also very important, why young people go out. Young people do not go out just to learn about wine. They go out to meet people and have a great time. When you're 25 today and you make the effort of putting your face on, of putting heels on putting makeup, on taking the risk of having a real life interaction with people that you don't know, you don't do it for wine. You do it because you want to find friends, you want to find a mate, you want to find someone to spend the night or the life with, but you don't do it just for wine. And I think that lesson is very important because wine events are usually just about wine and just about pushing the wine to consumers. If we really want to be a consumer facing industry, it has to be about them. So it means it has, of course, they're coming to learn something. They're coming because they know that the people around the table are going to be interested in learning the same thing. So it's a first common point. Let them have some time to discuss to each other, to share their views, to build their network. and to have fun actually. And that's something in like a wine bar as a sort of third space for people to come, like it was the type for pubs before, where people will come to be together, and then drinking beer was what you did to be together. And so it's slightly changing the focus on the wine itself, because we love wine so much, we just want to talk about it for a long time, to actually what the consumer wants. And they want something interesting, but they also want to have fun and the capacity to talk to the people that you will have curated, because they are at the same level of interest. If they, you might have consumers that drink labels. There's absolutely nothing wrong of being a label drinker, right? And showing off because the bottle that you have is the most expensive one, or the rarest to find and super difficult or super niche or whatever. There's nothing bad about this. But if you pair those people with people that are really geeky about the wine and comes from the love of learning, or the winemaker specificity, they're not going to have a good conversation. So how can you create those space in your wine tasting by curating the room and the topic, so actually you bring the reason for people to come back to your event, but also the it's how you, sorry, that's going to sound terrible, but how you monetize friendship, how you allow your events to actually allowing people to make friends through that, so they can have their community of people that will develop the love of wine with them. Because if you're not coming from you know um, a background where wine is drunk easily, then you will need those friends, and you will need someone to help you find your people, because they're not that easy to find.
One of the questions, I guess, that comes to my mind, and I do encourage everybody. You have a podcast, and a lot of
Yeah.
materials. In many ways, you have spent the time to know the answers to a lot of these questions. Recognizing that the wine industry is a little bit slow on the uptake to pay attention to these things and to implement some of the things that you're talking about, what is your level of optimism slash pessimism of where fine wine will be a decade from now?
It's an interesting question. I can take it from different sides. From the producer perspective, I'm really confident that producers will find solution and adaptation to climate change and to continue to make wonderful wine. That's the first thing, I have no doubt. I'm also quite confident in the fact that we do have some very intelligent people in the wine world. And so far, never underestimate something that's been here for 100 years or more. So that gives me optimism. Some of the things that, for example, women, and again, one of the way women are different than men is that they overinvest in that community thing. So women go to more events. When you ask them why they decided to join something, mostly the first reason is actually to meet people. Because if you need to find your people to drink wine and you're a woman, like the most likely thing is your girlfriends are not going to be interested by wine. It's that kind of snowball effect. The less women, the less. So how do you reverse that cycle? But also, and this is very specific to fine wine, and this is very specific to fine wine markets like London, to some extent New York. I wouldn't know in California. We haven't studied it. I guess it's a bit, or Miami or Florida. But the the fine wine segment is based on selling bottles. So the economic model of fine wine is to sell bottles. You make money by selling bottles. And because some of those wines have value on the secondary market, sometimes you make money by selling the same bottle 3 or 4 times to different consumers. And you encourage volume buy, like a good consumer will buy by cases of 12 traditionally, and you will you will sell a lot of them, that to them. Young people and women seems to be more interested in buying by smaller volume today. So that model of selling a lot of wine to a few people is no longer working by default, because people are buying less anyway. And there seem to be both young people and women more invested in the event and the community part of it. And so the big question is, can we find, because fine, always follow the money, but can we find a business model where merchants will make as much margins selling experience than selling bottles? And that's a question of scale. And I'm not sure. And where I'm a bit cautious. I think there's a way if you're good at numbers and you are creative, but I think that will require quite a lot of work. And I'm not sure that this work will be conducted every time because it's easier to stay with the model that we have today. So, and just maybe hope for the economy to be better and then things to become good again. We had 15 years of very easy, I mean, considering the last 15 years have been very good for the wine world. And suddenly we're in a phase where we now have to make effort to sell wine. And that's a huge shift for a lot of people. And some people will go heads on and they will invest a lot in trying to find those new models. Some people will not. So I, I just don't know how much will go and how much will not do things.
So, we've been talking a lot about work that you've done over several years. What are you working on now? Like, what's exciting and
Ah,
interesting to you, and kind of a preview of the stuff that we are looking forward to learning about going
yeah.
forward?
So two big projects that we've already started working on. So that's why I was talking about restaurants and the on-trade or the on-license in the US. But they're the two places where you can buy expensive wine. There's the off-trade and that's the on-trade. So we're doing something about fine wine and the restaurants because since COVID, the business model of restaurants have changed a lot and the cost of operation have changed a lot. And that impacts how the wine list is made. And that impacts how margins are made, the expectation of margins from the wine list, and that impacts a lot. Yeah, that has like for the preliminary research. To give you an example, in London, people have stopped working on cash margin on fine wine, but they apply a percentage, like a flat percentage margin on everything, which means that the fine wine that everybody knows the price of because you have it on your pocket are difficult to list in the wine list now because you need to apply a 70% margins on them, where before, when you were the sommelier, you could just decide on the cash margin. So it's pushed some of the classics and benchmark out of wine lists. It also means that what other restaurants had to do in order to keep those wines on the list was to have an average of 70%. So they will do a 90 or 95% on that Pinot Grigio at £18 on the buy the glass program so that they can keep the bottle of fine wine for, I don't know, 55% margins. And that has some impact as well. So we've just done preliminary research, but we're doing a big research on London, Copenhagen, Sao Paulo in Brazil, and New York. That we'll be finishing to conduct in the next 18 months. And the other big one is about the cultural relevance of wine and fine wine in particular. How can we articulate the cultural relevance of wine drinking? Because we talk, viticulture is protected. Like it's quite easy to argue or to make the case for viticulture and wine culture as a cultural product. When it comes to wine drinking and the other part, it's a bit different, and that's the part that it's changing. So we want to understand that. How can we? What are the conditions that are needed for wine and fine wine to continue to be relevant in society? That's a more like 360 kind of. The restaurant one is very practical and we'll have some very practical recommendation, just like the one on consumer. I'm sorry, I went very far on the concept, but there are some very practical recommendation on that paper about, as you were saying, if I have a wine bar, if I'm a wine merchant, how do I decide on allocation to favor new consumer to come in? There's loads of things like this on the paper, and there will be loads of things like this on the restaurants paper. The culture paper is more of a white paper, kind of framing the intellectual concept of things. So yeah, those are the two ones that I'm very excited about.
Well, I really appreciate it. I thank you for the free consulting. Hopefully, a few other people in the industry are paying enough attention to this podcast to know it. But even if you are not in the wine industry, it's important thought because it impacts a lot about the way in which we experience culture,
Yeah.
and throughout the world. And now that we're so interconnected and everybody is watching and seeing the same things, obviously that's going to continue. So, Pauline, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks so much, John.